This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. We'll begin the Building, Zoning, and Development Committee meeting this evening at 7 p.m. Present are committee members Williamson, Limpert, and Schumann, our council president, council members Broussard, Glassburn, Heeman, Kelly, the mayor, law director, finance director, HR director, our planning director, and our building commissioner. On the agenda this evening, we'll begin with 2020-145, which is an ordinance providing for the amendment of Chapter 1135, 1 and 2 Family Residence District of the Codified Ordinances of the City of North Olmsted. Director Lieber, I know that this was discussed last week. I don't know if there's any update to changes, but I do know that I have before me a few recommendations from council members, so I don't know how you would like to begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only feedback I've received from council, I received from Clerk Massarillo on Friday, a list of concerns from Councilman Glassburn. I've received no other comments from other council members, but I'm prepared to address those comments if you'd like me to go through them, or if you'd like the councilman to present the concern and I can offer staff comment, however you feel it would be most productive.
If you, I mean, I could even read them if you'd like, and then you can give us your answer. Or if Mr. Glassburn would like to summarize his bullet points, I do think that there are a few here that are worth discussion.
Okay, I'd be happy to kick off discussion unless Councilman Glassburn would want to take the lead, whatever facilitates things quickest.
If you're already familiar, go ahead.
I am. I've had a chance to read and review, and assume the rest of council has been provided his comments and also has had a chance to read and review. So I won't read verbatim, but I'll summarize as best I can. The first concern was in regards to the change to the recreational vehicle section, and the concern was over changing an objective standard to a subjective standard. You could recall that currently our code allows for vehicle storage in driveways for a period not to exceed 72 hours within a 21-day period. And so we had recommend a change to create a more subjective standard to allow driveway storage, driveway parking when the vehicle would be maintained or in preparation for use. So I think the concern there is, you know, that the subjective standard could be difficult. And I think in Mr. Glassburn's language, if council wants to increase enforcement, then there should be an objective standard. And if lenience is your objective, then he recommended eliminating the restriction. I don't have a strong opinion. That was a matter that came from the law department about the current language. If council wants to leave that language as is and not amend that section, that is fine with the administration. I do not recommend eliminating it altogether because that would allow every property owner in North Olmsted to store recreational vehicles in their driveway year-round every day. And I don't believe that's the intent of council when they established the requirements regarding how recreational vehicles could be stored and parked. So I guess I'll just step back and allow any other clarification or discussion on that item.
Thank you, Director. I'm assuming that in addition to RVs, this would be boats and all other sorts of things?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any recommendations from committee members?
Just a comment. I would agree with the planning director that we definitely don't want to remove the language completely, because that does open up to where it's permissible permanently.
So are we going to go toward the subjective or objective? I'd like to know what the position is of some of our ward members who may have issues with this. Mr. Limpert, did you have another
Well, I just wanted an additional clarification. So, Mr. Grow, I know you've harped on it's hard for the building inspectors to kind of track that 72-hour window. How would they track that maintenance is being performed? Is there some sort of like evidence that they're doing maintenance on the vehicle? Or I guess that's what I'm trying to understand is how it would be easier to enforce with the new standards.
Councilwoman, if I may. Councilwoman Williamson, if I may, please. Thank you. Thank you, Councilman Limpert. It really originated with Mr. O'Malley's observation with property maintenance violations and working through some of the zoning code violations and how these things are brought to the attention of the city and how they are brought to prosecution if it gets to that. It was a determination that it was a bit of a challenge on this notion of a 72 hours in a 21-day period. It was thought that there perhaps could be another way to do it where we could permit, in preparation for use or maintenance, but otherwise it's not supposed to be there. I submit to you that there's going to be some challenges either way when you do this. If you want to, if you, at least we can have a conversation as we typically would with our inspectors when there's a vehicle parked there. If somebody's got a motorhome parked there, a 35 or 40 foot long motorhome parked there in their driveway for a month, it's clearly not, likely to be there for maintenance purposes. It's there for storage. So it's going to come down to the observations of the individual inspectors and whatever they should uncover in their investigation as to whether or not the charges are brought. Otherwise you're going out with a 72 hours consecutive in a 21-day period. We just thought it was kind of a strange standard, and it's one that in the past has presented an enforcement problem. But again, I'm kind of with the director on this, Director Lieber. The first question is you have to decide whether or not you want to continue to regulate these. And the second discussion, if that's the case, is that do you want to have a discussion as to how we can best achieve enforcement? Historically, the experience of Mr. O'Malley is that the current standard has been fairly unworkable. So he's trying to find another standard that would perhaps present a more workable way to address this issue. But that's, so the first question is, do you want to do it? Second question is, then how do we go about doing it?
Go ahead, Mr. Limpert.
Yeah, Ms. Williamson, so from a committee perspective, I do think it still should be regulated. I'm kind of comfortable with deferring to the law department in regards to how it could be best enforced, as long as it's articulated as such for residents to follow. I know I've had seen residents where they've had the vehicle parked and they bring it in on a Sunday and they're leaving on a Friday to go for a 3-day weekend, but they picked it up to get it prepped during the week. So, theoretically that's 96 hours, so if somebody wants to slam them for that kind of creates a challenge. Whereas if it's more subjective, I think, there's, skilled people that can see whether there's repeat offenders or repeat issue or not. So that's just my thoughts on it, but I do think it should still be enforced.
Councilman Broussard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I am neither a RV owner or a boat owner, so I don't have a strong opinion, but I just want to share. You had asked for some input from the ward people. So I can tell you that in my 12 years on council, it's actually been a pretty strong objective to a lot of the residents to be very vigilant about reporting RVs and boats parked in driveways. So although I don't personally have a strong opinion on it, the residents, at least of Ward 1, seem to have a strong opinion on it. So just for that matter alone, that would be the will of the people in my eyes. And so I would recommend about not eliminating language altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I personally don't have any objection to an individual keeping one recreational vehicle, whether it be a boat or an RV. I think the problem children, so to speak, of this issue are those that tend to collect lots of toys in their back and side yards and don't maintain them, and they're just sitting there in a junkyard fashion. So I'm probably in the minority. I would prefer to allow one, and under certain circumstances. I don't have a specific recommendation as to what those circumstances would be. But pragmatically, in my ward at least, I see not a majority or even a significant minority, but a substantial amount of folks that have these recreational vehicles in their driveways, certainly much more often than 3 days out of 21. And so the pragmatic effect of this, I think we need to understand, is this to increase enforcement or to try to find a more workable standard? And if it's not to increase enforcement, then I would suggest a different, more workable standard. I agree the 72 hours in 3 weeks is kind of a wonky standard to try to enforce.
Thank you. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my Ward 4, there seems to be a similarity to Mr. Glassburn's ward. So for example, a younger family, right? They're working really Monday through Friday, and to take their vehicles or boats, whatever they are, out of storage, they might not be able to do that on a Thursday to then be able to travel and use it on Friday. So it does sit there a little longer, although it's not a continuous thing. But depending on how often they may use that, it could be a week-to-week occurrence over kind of I'll call them the height of the summer months, if you will, sort of midsummer, because they choose to go to campgrounds, for example, and not rent the lot. Okay, they just pay for it as they use it. Other folks that I know that have these are retired, so they have a luxury of a little bit more time, but they don't have the energy for less time. So there's equally sit a certain number of days while they've pulled it out of storage and they slowly kind of pack it up, and then they go on their trip. And then when they return from their trip, it is sitting in their driveway again for, more than 72 hours. I don't find, except for I think I had one or two residents that were of a more habitual nature. So that said, again, 72 hours is a little difficult, but I don't know what statement exactly should be made to address that. Permanency is really not something conducive to most of the lot and driveway sizes in my ward. There are some, but I don't think enough that it could be a permanent placement for a summer. But certainly it's a little bit more than just a few hours in and out. They're gone and then they're back and unpacking. So that is what relatively happens in my ward. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Lieber, the way that this section is amended, it removes the 72-hour period. So I guess my question would be, at what point would the inspectors be out citing people if they were there because of a complaint from a resident, or if they happen to drive by a couple days in a row?
There's probably two instances where they might take note. Complaint would be the most likely, and sweeps would be the other, except that for sweeps, again, it's not that you can never have an RV parked in a driveway. So probably it would have to be observed on multiple days as inspectors were in the neighborhood. But I'd say primarily this is a complaint-driven enforcement, exactly because they're mobile and not always in the driveway. Neighbors tend to observe when things are static and there for a while and might call on them. But I'd say that's the primary way that we would be alerted to a concern.
So if a resident was, just say they were repairing the inside, I'm only asking because these things are going to come up. If they were repairing the inside and it was going to take maybe a week or two, is there any kind of process where our residents aren't cited, where they could call in and special, exemptions could be made for that time period?
It'd certainly not be cited if it was actively under maintenance. And if the inspector couldn't observe the maintenance occurring, they would probably make contact with the resident and have the resident provide a time frame under which the project was taking place, and just check back after that self-imposed time frame is over to determine if it was removed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schuman?
I had 10 years of doing this. I can't think of too many times anybody's called me about this. It seems to me that when I have heard about it, it's almost like a character of the neighborhood kind of thing. They're in a couple of the neighborhoods where houses are closer, Bretton Ridge, Park Ridge. I might have heard in there about somebody parking one long term, but you don't hear about it on Barton Road where people have real deep driveways, or just, I don't know. This is a tough one. I sympathize with Director Garreau trying to come up with a way to deal with this. I don't know how you do it. And you know, at what point an inspector comes out, they mark down that they saw it. They come back 3 days later, it's there. People could have been gone too for the last 2 of those days. You don't know. It's a tough call. But again, I don't get a lot of calls on this. Thank you.
Mr. Broussard and then Ms. Heeman.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Just an observation, and I don't even know why I know this, but I believe 2020 was a record year for RV sales and purchases because of the pandemic. So obviously not all of those are going to land in North Olmsted, but I suspect the fact that we're talking about this right now from a timing standpoint might be a good thing, because the instances might occur at a greater rate than they have in the past. So that's just my armchair quarterback observation. Thank you.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we know, Director Lieber, how many complaints we've had in each calendar year? For example, for the last 3 years, how many have we had? Do we know that?
I do not, but perhaps Mr. Grusemeyer might have a better figure.
I don't have it at this time. I'm not familiar with any that have happened recently. I would have to, we'd have to research that and get back to you if you're interested in knowing that. We do not have a large number of them.
I think Ms. Lieber had a comment.
Madam Chair, I think you're on mute, so I
thought you guys liked me better that way. Director Lieber and then Director Gallo.
and hopefully this helps as well, but our concern is not simply just parking on driveways, it's front yard areas. So this limiting language has to do with parking of vehicles in front yard areas. So it's possible that if you have a driveway that extends past your house into the backyard and a garage, that if it's stored there on a side yard or a rear yard, that's fine. We're really talking about the impact when vehicles are stored between the face of the house and the street. So I thought there could be a misconception that driveways were off limits, and that's not the case. It's simply front yard areas that are the concern of this particular section.
Director Gallo.
Madam Chair, I just want to echo Commissioner Grusemeyer's comments that we will get council the information regarding recreational vehicles for 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Limpert.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Williams. I think just hearing all this from a committee perspective, to me, it seems like something that we shouldn't really move forward with until we get a little bit more statistics on it and, understand, just play it forward maybe with a couple of the instances that have been cited in the past and see how that would be handled from the new amendment, then to change the language. given that this doesn't seem to be like a hot button issue that's coming up a lot, or we don't have the numbers to show that.
I agree. Mr. Moderator Grow.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Grusenmeyer, it's when we're talking about citations, do we keep track of data for complaints based upon that versus citations issued? Because in my experience, look, we're not here to take people to court. Many times, if there's a complaint logged, somebody goes out, it resolves itself, and it's finished. It may not necessarily be the number that arrives for prosecution, because a lot, like any property maintenance or zoning code enforcement, once there's contact made, most of these things get resolved. You have a conversation with people and you get to the bottom of it. And if they're repairing their vehicle, or it's going to be sitting there for 2 weeks because they're putting a new interior in, or they're waterproofing it or something, that's going to be fine. The standard now doesn't really allow for that, but the new one presumably would. It would give you a little bit more flexibility. But do we have this? We could pull the statistics on complaints versus actual citations, Mr. Grusenmeyer?
I could look into it. I know Katie is listening to our meeting tonight, and we're going to research seeing if we can find an information one versus the other. I will tell you that there's not a large number. I think generally what happens, yes, our intention in the building department isn't to prosecute people, it's to generally speak with them first and attempt to have some type of compliance. And many times people buy an RV or something not realizing the restrictions that may be present upon them. So it takes them, and it takes some arrangement for them to find another way to either store it in the backyard or somewhere, or on a third-party site or something like that. So generally, we look for people when we contact them when there's a complaint. We try and find what we would call a reasonable date certain where it can be complied. And the only ones that the law department would ever see is where we really can't come to any conclusion. They just aren't being cooperative at all in attempting to resolve the issue. But we could look into that. I'm not sure exactly when we file those. I'll have to look into how we maintain that information, and we'll try and get everything we can get for you.
Thank you. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know the answer, but here's the dilemma, I think. And that could be, for example, how much space do you have? What's your lot size? Because front, side, or back doesn't make any difference if you're the person that lives on the next street over looking at the boat when you're sitting on your deck. And there's a boat or an RV in the backyard. And that's really great that the neighbor across the street doesn't have to look at it. But now, we've created a different problem by saying, oh, put it in your backyard. So I think that there's a little bit deeper of a dive that needs to go into regulating that you just can't see it from the street. It could be just as obnoxious to the neighbor next door or the neighbor behind, depending on what your geographic situation is. So I'd like to see something a little bit, discussed a little bit more along those lines, and the impact that has on those other neighbors, not just the neighbor across the street, or looking at it from the front, and like doing the front of your hair and not the back. Thanks.
Okay. Well, based on all of the comments, I just have a question regarding number 2, where it says recreational vehicles shall be parked or stored entirely within an enclosed building. So I don't understand this whole paragraph, to be honest with you. It kind of doesn't make sense to me. So could you please explain what the intent was? Because it's a little confusing as to whether they need to be enclosed or not enclosed.
Madam Chair, the intent was to require, if there were many recreational vehicles, that they be enclosed, except that 1, or is it 2? I don't have the full code in front of me at the moment. May be stored outside so long as they're inside or rear yard areas. And I believe that there's a stable surface or a surface requirement for them as well. So that really isn't changing. That wasn't part of the amendment. That has been part of our code for a very long time.
So it has to be in an enclosed building?
There's, I think, the accept that language in that code section that does allow for outdoor storage of up to, is it 2?
Yes.
So if there was ski-doos and boats and golf carts and I don't know, think of all the things that there could be. I think that the council at the time this was adopted wanted some limit on the number of things that could be stored outdoors. So they came up with the language of shall be stored enclosed, except allowing for a certain number to be outside.
Well, what I don't understand is why one couldn't even be stored outside. So initially I thought that this was going to the point where one was allowed to be outside, and now it's not supposed to be outside unless it's enclosed. I'm just saying, I'm having a hard time understanding this. I would like to see this reworked, because if I'm having a hard time understanding it, I can't imagine our residents could interpret it, unless maybe it's just me.
Yeah.
But I think this is just rather confusing.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
it's just essentially saying that not more than 2 can be outside. Is really yeah.
Right, but the one has to be enclosed.
No, it says not more than 2. Not more than 2 can be stored outside.
But see, this is where I'm reading it. It says shall be parked or stored entirely within an enclosed building. And then if you have more than one, then you can have the one parked outside. That's what I'm interpreting this to read.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I agree. It could be reworded.
It needs to be fixed up, cleaned up. All right, we already know that we're gonna have to come back to this. So if we could have our number of complaints handled, if we could get those out perhaps for our next meeting, as well as the language in number 2 to be tightened up, that would be great. And then we can address any other questions at that time. So let's move on to the second suggestion, which would be carports. So are any of our residents going to be grandfathered into the carports?
Yes. So the way our code reads now, carports are not expressly permitted. They're not within the list of the permitted accessory structures that are in 113502. But in the prohibition language was that language we felt could cause confusion. So yeah, we do not permit new carports to be constructed by right because they're not expressly permitted. But any carport currently in existence can remain and is considered legal nonconforming.
Are there any questions from council? Committee? No? All right, thank you. Moving on to the next one, temporary ramps.
Madam Chair, I think it's important to point out that this is one of the unusual cases where we are actually having a temporary use regulation and a zoning code. For the most part, zoning deals with things that are permanent structures. So I also want to point out that any resident can propose a permanent ramp or structure that would not need to be removed, subject to zoning and also the requirements of the Residential Code of Ohio. So when we create a section on temporary ramps, specifically the word temporary indicates a time limitation, that it's not permitted forever. So I think the concern was about establishing a time limitation on the removal of ramps. But if we don't establish a time limit of removal, then it is not, we can't call it temporary because we're not requiring removal. We have no way of enforcing the removal. So if council wants to change the number of days that it could be removed, I wouldn't have a strong objection. But when it comes to temporary ramps, we're not applying the standards of the Residential Code of Ohio. We're being much more lenient. We're responding quickly to the needs of a resident and their physical needs. So I guess if we're going to say it's a temporary section, there still should be some time limitation, and would just encourage council to pick a time that you feel appropriate then for removal rather than eliminate that particular line.
And what if by mere coincidence, a new family comes in and has a need for the ramp, then how do they address that with the city?
I'm sure they can communicate with the building department, again, what that need is. This is meant to provide relief. This is not meant to be substituted for a permanent structure where you might move into a property knowing that there's a permanent disability, because there are requirements under the Residential Code of Ohio for ramps. The type we're talking about tend to be the kind that have no foundation. They're usually metal. They can be put down simply and picked up simply. And, you know, they're not meant for durability and super long-term use. I imagine the building official could probably chime in a little bit more on what he's actually seen in terms of the ramps and then how the codes regulate. But again, I think the important distinction here is that this isn't just a ramps section, it's temporary. And so I think the definition of temporary would be time limited and something we should just think about in context of establishing a remove by date.
Thank you. Any questions from committee? Council, Ms. Heeman, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, quickly. My hand was up quickly. Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question is, you know, I have run into actually the situation that, you know, the resident was deemed to perhaps able to get better at therapy, and it actually came down to quite a battle about getting their extended permit for this temporary metal ramp, and it was very difficult. It was not easy to work with the building department, even though they still had a need. And they could not put it on the side of their home. They could not put it on the back of their home. So how do you determine then when, oh, time's up, you're not the doctor, and if the doctor's still saying, well, you know, that person is still in therapy, they're still, you know, potentially getting better, how do you just make that cutoff? And the extension was never really granted. I was told just forget about it for now, but now is now. So I'd like to know the answer, please. How do you anticipate handling that when you don't know how long a resident will need, quote, a temporary ramp, in your opinion? Thank you.
I think this is a building official question more than a planning director question.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm not familiar with the case you're looking at. I think part of that deals with the fact that the ramp that they wanted to install would fall under the jurisdiction of the Residential Code of Ohio, which does have time limits on it. Currently, this actually came about at my request because we currently have a need. Individuals have a need to install ramps due to a disability, and currently we kind of turn the other way because we don't really want to tell them no, but they're really not permitted under the zoning code. So I think we need to have some allowance that gives us within the zoning code the abilities to allow these. I think that as far as when the length of time, we're not looking to be the doctor or determine what the length of time is. But I think at some point the individual needs, if we find out the individual needs to know that at the time that there's no longer a need for these, they can be removed. As I say, currently we kind of look the other way because we understand the need for these when someone has a disability. We're in the position right now if a next door neighbor were to complain that it was placed, that they placed one of these in the front yard or something else, it actually is not permitted under the zoning ordinance. I would like to give us some protection for both for the resident and for the building department in allowing these. But I think we do not determine when it isn't. I mean, generally we enforce based on complaint. I don't know that you know, we're not in the medical business, but the assumption is once it's no longer needed, usually we approach these if there's a concern, we simply talk to the resident. If they express it, if it continues to be needed, then we're not going to challenge that issue. If they inform us upon speaking with them it's no longer needed, we would have a discussion with them and request them to be removed within a reasonable date certain or some time where it could be removed.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Grusenmeyer. Sometimes that is very confusing to us. All of your knowledge sometimes is confusing. My resident in particular was denied an extension of the request, and we're told that in order to have a ramp that it could not be metal and that it had to be put in the back of their home. And unfortunately, that didn't permit the right pitch for this person to get up and down the ramp, and or a good door width for that person to become able to take their wheelchair in the back doorway. And so what I'd like is for us to have clear guidelines, very clear, and to not be sued for ADA, because obviously, you know, people need these ramps. And I don't know so far that, you know, the denial of that extension was pretty unsettling to my resident and also to me. And so I would like for this particular section to be very concrete as to what is and is not acceptable. And I'd also like to know, why is it that a metal ramp is not acceptable or was not? Thank you.
Once again, I have to look into more detail. I'm not familiar with the exact detail of your concern, but if the request is for a permanent ramp, it has certain limitations both under the code and under the residential code under our zoning ordinance and under the residential code of Ohio. I agree with you. I wrote up this language.
The request was for a temporary ramp, and they were given that 6-month permit. And then when they wanted to renew it, they were given one renewal when it was still deemed that the resident had the ability to, you know, increase her capacity. That next extension was denied. So Ms. Lieber, I believe that you are familiar with this. Perhaps you could help Mr. Grusemeyer understand the circumstance of which my question is generated. Thank you.
Director Gallo, I did see your hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. From what I recall, was this in the historic district? Is it okay? So I would defer back to the building commissioner. I don't. There might have been different restrictions, but from what I recall, I believe this was in a different district of the city. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, perhaps then we can have Mr. Grusemeyer provide that information to council for our next meeting, perhaps maybe beforehand, as to the different types of temporary ramps, amount of time, location. Would that cover it, Ms. Heeman?
Almost. The differential here is that the historic district can't really have different ADA rules than some other part of our city. So that has been, you know, the constant rub with, you know, my undertaking of wanting to always discuss the historic district. These folks are so restricted, they can't live their lives. And I really had to spend a lot of time and go to bat, and not that I'm not willing to do that, you know, with the administration to get them to be able to keep that ramp. And part of it was because they're in the historic district, and you cannot, I do not understand how legally you can say, you know, if you live over here, you can have that. If you live over here, well, you can't. So that, I think, needs a lot of clarification, at least for me. Thank you.
Okay. Are we clear then on what information needs to be provided for that section? Directors, I'm not sure who's going to get this, but are we good? Do we know what?
I think building can provide information on the specific case cited by Councilwoman Heeman. But also, I think we're all talking about, you know, doing something positive for residents here, both, you know, what the Councilwoman's concerns are, but also what the proposal is to specifically allow for a temporary ramp where currently today none exists. So this zoning amendment helps building be able to provide these approvals for temporary situations that they really were kind of winging it before. So I would say that this is, if there's frustrations in the past, this is in part to smooth out those frustrations and to benefit residents who need these accommodations. So I think we're rowing in the same direction on this one, Madam Chair.
Would it be beneficial, though, to put in here that, I mean, I guess Mr. Grusemeyer said that long-term ramps are made of wood, temporary ramps are made of metal. So would it be beneficial to differentiate between the two here in this temporary section? I mean, I can't imagine someone's going to put in a wooden ramp if it's not going to be permanent. But there might be a case where there's a carpenter in the family willing to do it for a lot cheaper than what a metal ramp would cost. So I'm just asking if that should probably be mentioned here in this section, or at least covered. So when this issue comes about, it will already be addressed, or you'll be able to do something with it.
Madam Chair, I see Mr. Grusenmeyer's hand has been up on that question, I believe.
Yeah, if I may. The difference isn't necessarily material. The difference is under both zoning and the building code. So let's talk about zoning first. In the situation, what I've tried to provide here is something that addresses the situation which occurs, so we don't have individuals who need it on a temporary basis, so they are able to easily have a ramp, installed for them. The material the ramp is made of doesn't really matter. What's really, even though the vast majority of temporary ramps are the metal prefabricated types, but there's nothing that stops anyone from constructing a temporary ramp of a different material, such as wood. The real difference isn't the material. The difference is the longevity of how long it's going to be installed, where it's permitted to be installed, and if it's going to be permanent, then it has to comply with both our permanent zoning ordinance as far as its location and the Residential Code of Ohio as far as its construction. What we're trying to do is provide an exception within the zoning ordinance right now for that for the number of cases we have where it's not, people do not want to install necessarily a permanent ramp for their situation, but they have someone who is in the home who will need it for some period of time, after which it will be removed. And the idea is within the zoning ordinance to give them some additional options to place it within yards where it currently would not be permitted, and then looking upon as a temporary piece of construction rather than a permanent would not need to comply with the Residential Code of Ohio. So the material it's composed of is not necessarily important. What's important is to realize that if it's temporary, it can be placed within yards as long as it's not within 3 feet of a side yard, so you're not too close to the neighbors, and it would be removed once that need is no longer there. If it's permanent or a permanent situation, then you would look to install it within the confines of what the current ordinance allows as far as side yard and front yard setbacks, and it would comply with the Residential Code of Ohio. So it's giving us, I think, the city or the people who need it some easy options to install something for the time they need it, as long as it's removed at the time it's no longer needed.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions from Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I just want to reiterate a couple things and make sure that we're all on the same page. If somebody is putting in a temporary ramp, this is not a cosmetic gain for anybody. They're in a difficult situation. To me, the goal should be to not create any interaction that they would need with the city in this type of situation. To me, the compelling city interest is the after the fact, if it's been lingering so long that now it's becoming in disrepair and now becoming a maintenance issue. So if we can find a way to address at that point, to me, 30 days is not anywhere near that point. I don't want to burden a disabled resident for or say that to their estate as they inherit it, or to the new landowner for a home that's probably not been maintained very well because the resident's disabled, that they need to spend their time in the first month of ownership getting rid of a ramp as opposed to fixing likely substantial issues with the roof or other systems of the house. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Glassburn. Would you like to recommend, would you suggest 60 days, 90 days? Just so we have something that we can.
Madam Chair, I don't have a specific suggestion. I don't know what is relevant to our other standards. I don't want to create a precedent that is problematic for our other items, but I don't think people are willingly wanting to have these metal temporary structures in their front yards. I don't think this is something someone aspires to have. I would rather trust the judgment of the resident to decide when it needs to go than to try to put some kind of timeline on it. And to me, the longer the timeline, the better, if we must have one. But to me, there should be, if this thing is in disrepair, there should be other alternatives that we should be able to cite it for, because it's something that's in disrepair in the yard, not because it's a ramp, if that makes sense.
Yes. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do agree with Councilman Glassburn, because I can state, factually that within my ward, when I've gone door to door for different reasons and purposes, there are some that are in such disrepair that an able-bodied person can't use the ramp. You'd fall through. And I've had to hop over holes and boards missing, etc. And I'm sure that ramp is no longer being used by anyone in that household. I can't even imagine that it wouldn't fall apart. So to the maintenance side of it, yes, I agree that, there has to be a code for that they are metal or otherwise. And again, in the front yard, nobody really wants this thing hanging in front of their house unless you have to have it. So I do agree with Mr. Glassburn on that. Thank you.
As do I. Okay, so then I will mark up some of these and we will ask for amendments here as well. Moving on to 113507, that section deals with wraparound porches or entrance structures.
Madam Chair, I think there might be a slight misunderstanding about the intent of this amendment, because the two pictures shown in this in the feedback do meet code. So our typical front yard setback for residential structures is 50 feet. So at the 50-foot mark and beyond, a house can be designed any which way with any type of porch projection. Well, I guess the word projection is specific. Projection means there's an encroachment into the front yard. So what the code presently allows is for an encroachment of the stairs or stoop not more than 8 feet into the required front yard. So the house sits at 50, but this entrance feature can project 8 feet closer, so 42 feet from the front lot line. So, what we're trying to say is, de facto, if we have no limit of the number of square feet, people can build a porch that would take their house line to 42 feet by right, and that whole area could potentially be stoop or porch. So we're certainly not at all trying to limit the style of homes, the beautiful porches, those entrance features. We're saying that just because you have a stoop doesn't grant you 8 additional feet across your entire frontage of house. Otherwise, we should establish our building line at 42 feet, not at 50 feet. So I thought perhaps this was originated in a misunderstanding, and that could clear up what the intent was.
Thank you. Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the intent is to keep projections 50 linear feet from the road, then we should say 50 linear feet. When it said 50 square feet, I assumed the area, or I understood it to mean the area of the structure, not how far it is from the road. So I'm not sure that square feet is the right term.
I think the confusion might lie, Madam Chair, in the fact that there's two standards that have the number 50 in them. There's a 50 linear foot front setback requirement, but we are proposing a maximum of 50 square feet of any entrance feature that would be allowed to project into that required yard. So one is area and one is distance. They just both happen to be 50. but they're different measurements.
The linear feet is not included in this section, though.
Correct. The linear feet is in the section that talks about setback.
Okay. Mr. Glassburn.
So if we're talking about both, then again, I'm still not understanding the benefit of the restriction of 50 square feet of the structure. What is the magic number? Again, the two examples that are very nice examples, you know, 170, one's over 200. Why do we care how large the thing is as long as it's 50 feet from linear feet from the street?
We do not, and that's not what this section does. This talks only about projections. So if that stoop or step or porch begins 50 feet away from the road, it can be as large as the homeowner would like. We're saying that within that 50-foot setback, if you are going to project into that required setback, that the area that you can project into should be limited. It shouldn't be like the entire width of your lot, for example. It should be something less. But if the start of the stoop or the step or the front patio begins at 50 feet, it can be as large as the homeowner would wish.
Thank you, Director. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, do you, Director Lieber, think, and Director Gallo, think that it's maybe coming time where we start cross-referencing our sections code to code, you know, like the Ohio Revised Code, for example? You know, when you're reading it, it you know, has a hyperlink and it refers you then to the other point of reference that it is talking about. Because, you know, trying to stand at the building department window and someone's going to try and explain all this to a resident is very convoluted, I think. So maybe we're, you know, if you're wanting to clean all this up, maybe it's coming time that we actually, you know, start the cross-reference process and give residents the tools that they need to know all of the rules and not just one over here, one over there, and like the linear versus square feet. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from committee or council? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to 113507, projection C, which deal with the air conditioners. Go on, Director.
The concern here is the location of air conditioning units. The amendment that we proposed, currently the section does not exist. And so any new air conditioning unit that were to be installed has to meet the minimum yard setback of the main structure. So this was meant to provide some relief to still allow location of air conditioning units, the condensers that would encroach. Again, this is like the projection section. So projections references places where you can enter into a yard which would otherwise not be a buildable area. And I think the building official should address the specific concerns about replacing existing, or because it is my understanding that if a resident currently has a condensing unit in a side yard in a manner that would not be permitted for new construction, but it's existing, that they can replace it at its current location without an issue. So I do think that if we're already allowing replacement in existing locations and now we're benefiting residents by allowing projections where we formerly didn't allow them, the ordinance is becoming more liberal and more helpful to residents, not more restrictive. So I guess if Mr. Grusemeyer has anything to add on that subject, I think it could be helpful.
Oh, thank you. Currently, there are no, under the zoning ordinance, there are no permitted locations for them. I mean, there's nothing, they're not listed as a permitted structure or anything within any of the yards. So what this does is liberalizes and establishes that, in fact, you're allowed to have condensers both in the rear and side yard where we've had them. I believe also we address condensers maintained to the rear yard simply because there's almost a practical impossibility of placing in the side yard and meeting the sound ordinance, I think is another one. So, yeah, so currently in our current policy, and I'm not aware of anything different, our current policy is if you have an existing side yard condenser and want to replace it in kind as a maintenance issue, that's an administrative permit that's issued to the individual. So we don't require them to move it out of there. But this would allow, as a matter of right, to place. It establishes and liberalizes and provides the residents, as a matter of right, the ability to place a condenser in a side yard or a rear yard within those appropriate restrictions, so they're not too close to the lot line. It's just something we don't have, and I think it's just good to establish a uniform basis upon which we approve them, upon which we allow them, and it's much more liberal than anything. It's a liberalization of certainly what we have right now.
Madam Chair, you were muted.
I keep doing that. I'm sorry. Thank you. So what about the screening? Are we going to be explaining that in more detail, or are we just giving the resident the opportunity to put up whatever they want?
This code indicates that screening is only required when the unit would be in a required side yard. So again, like if it's set back the minimum distance, screening's not required. It's if it is coming closer to the property line than would have otherwise been required, then screening's required. And we kind of purposefully stayed away from specifying the exact materials. So if they wanted to use some landscape fencing or some shrubbery, like they could pick whatever's best suited their particular situation. Just so long as it was the height of the unit.
So having been on this committee, when people have put up structures for animals and they've used blankets with 2 pieces of wire, what if there was somebody who used a pole with sheets to cover their section? I think that there has to be some kind of identity as to what's not going to be accepted, because you're going to run into this. And again, if it's screened off, what recourse do we have to say you can't have that?
I'm happy to suggest amendments that would specifically indicate fencing or landscaping if those 2 are suitable options to council.
Or moreover, what would not be permitted, rather than, you know, going through the list of what they can have. What about what they can't use? You know, maybe it has to be a structure that's, you know, sturdy, and however you would go about it. But I think that might be easier to do than tell them what they can have. Maybe? Okay, thank you. Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We don't, where I live, Director, we don't have backyards. We have a golf course. There's 2 feet from the home is all that there is all the way around the property. So everything is in a side yard, and no one here could have a generator according to your rules, because it would have to be put in the back. Most of the backyards were taken up with a little bit of patio space and things that when the homes were built, and it wouldn't ever meet the noise requirement. So we are completely over here, you know, out of the box, can't have them, don't even ask. How do you attempt to resolve that for homes where, for example, you know, their whole backyard has been already landscaped and they have a deck and they have this and they have that, and they want a generator in the side yard? How are you going to fix that for those folks? What do they do?
Madam Chair, I don't believe that your property is zoned 1 or 2 family residence. So I believe it's zoned cluster, and in which case we're not talking about the same governing chapter. So these regulations govern 1A, B, and C, 1 family and 2 family, which tend to be the more traditional lots with the traditional setbacks. So when you have the more complicated property configurations of attached units, this is not what this particular code is governing. It is governing the standard side yard, rear yard, front yard setbacks that we find in our residential neighborhoods. There's also, for any resident that finds themselves on a lot that is zoned 1 or 2 family, that does have a tight configuration, there's always the possibility of requesting a variance where the configuration of the lot is unique. That is like the definition of when you would ask for a variance, is where the lot is so shaped unique or such a size or orientation that following the strict application of the code isn't possible. When it comes to the sound, however, I think that's not a zoning issue. That's over in the general offenses code. And so I believe that there might be a variance process for that as well, but it's not through the Building and Zoning Board of Appeals.
Madam Chair, may I? That's so complicated for somebody that just wants a generator. 2 variances, all the notices that go out, that's just hugely complicated for someone that just wants a generator for whatever their reason is that they want one. And when we were, approached and voted on, the noise ordinance for the generator, it was such a great thing. It was going to be great. They hardly make any noise. This will be great. And now in this code, it's becoming, extremely problematic and convoluted, and the two cannot be easily put together. And I think we need to really look at this because it affects the bulk of people in my ward, not just my development, but the bulk of people in my ward that have smaller lots. Their backyards are pretty well laid out. They can't hardly get swimming pools, let alone then having to have all of this because they want or need a generator. So I think that this just really isn't helpful at all. Thank you.
Director.
Madam Chair, our code currently is silent on the placement of these units, as Mr. Grusemeyer said. And so the application of the code currently is any structures have to meet the minimum yard setback is contained in the zoning code. So again, this is a liberalization of what we would currently allow, which is not to allow any encroachments. Generators, from what we understand, produce a certain decibel level of noise. And so practically, we can look at how our lots are laid out, how houses are oriented on lots, the minimum required setbacks, and to look at our neighborhoods and to see generally there's between 5 and 20 feet generally between houses or between a dwelling and a side lot line. And then you can also look at the decibel levels of generators that are commonly installed. And you can see that if installed in a side yard, that generator is not going to meet that required noise level, that will exceed. And so the intent here was to, in restricting generators to rear yards, was to acknowledge the fact that a standard size lot, of which we have all over North Olmsted, if a generator were placed in the side yard, could not meet the noise requirement. And instead of sending mixed messages to a homeowner that, yes, you can have a generator in your side yard, but you'll never be able to meet the sound level requirements. So then you're going to be in violation of another code. And then the neighbor will be frustrated by the fact that they are subject to this noise produced by the neighbor. So this was an attempt to be consistent, not to be confusing, but to have our noise regulations line up with our zoning regulations. So we're not granting permission on one side, but saying you can't on another. So that was certainly the intent, was consistency, not confusion. Thank you.
Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sadly, it confused my little brain quite well. So my statement to that really is that when you think about the use of a generator, right, it's only in a power outage. So it only self-tests within the hours that we specified in the noise portion for the generator, in the noise ordinance for the generator. And so since it is really only operating in an emergency situation, I don't really understand why a neighbor would complain. I'm thinking the neighbor's asking to run an extension cord to, get power to their house. I really think this is way too complicated for a generator that's required in an emergency situation and not a day-to-day living situation. We have city power, we have all kinds of great stuff, but it's an emergency use. So the noise ordinance thing seems out the window unless it's excessively loud, but we did take care of that. I just don't see why someone should have to perhaps rip up their deck in order to put a generator there, because now in a power outage, they want to not have their, freezer melt. So I just think this is complicated, way overcomplicated for its emergency generator use. Thank you.
Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There were just two items I wanted to address. First was I wanted to know, the way I read this, existing homes that have air conditioners on the side of their home that would violate this would now have to add screening to their air conditioner that they've had in that place for 50 years. And I want to make sure that that is not the case. And then secondly, I'm glad to hear about this of being able to replace in those situations an employee who's no longer with the city in 2019 made 3 separate families move their air conditioners to the back of their homes. So, and I've never seen residents more irate than these 3 families. So I hope we don't ever have a situation like that again. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other discussion on this, I'm going to recommend that we hold 2021-145 in committee and ask for a second.
Second.
Anyone? Thank you, Mr. Limpert. All in favor say aye.
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 Okay, motion passes with a vote of 3-0. Our last item on the agenda is 2020-77, which is an ordinance amending section 113502 of the zoning code of the city of North Olmsted entitled accessory uses for the purpose of eliminating the 200-foot residential lot setback requirement for animal shelters used for chickens as amended. Now, I am now looking at the new amended version that we received. I believe it may have been from Mr. O'Malley. However, this amended version, we need to add an S into chickens in the heading because it's only one chicken. So if we could get that fixed, that would be great. Who would like to pick up and run with this ball? I know it was discussed at the last meeting that I was not in attendance at. And I don't know if I shall divert to Director Lieber.
Madam
Or Mr.
Chair, I'm happy just to review, but all the edits were Mr. Schumann's. And there was also some weigh-in by Mr. Limpert and Ms. Heeman regarding some cross-referencing to the property maintenance code, but they are changing the distance from 200 feet, and then the original version eliminated that 200-foot distance. Planning Commission recommended 25. It increased to 40 in this version. It also requires enclosure, full enclosure, and it also requires removal if not in use after a certain number of continuous days. So it was really just those items specifically discussed at the last committee meeting, and other than Mr. Schumann's well-ventilated phrase to be added, I hadn't received any other committee or council feedback. So those were the changes that were made.
Thank you. Might I ask, with the ventilation on it, does that mean that it can have windows and of that sort?
I would think, I think the purpose is to have it ventilated. So I think windows would be fine, but it still needs to be enclosed. So they have to be able to be closed or screened or something of that nature, not wide open.
Right, but if there were screens on them, then that's fine.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Limpert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Grove, I know we had an exchange about the verbiage. So the new language includes the run as part of the overall size of the.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
The entire area. Yeah. which would include any, whether being harbored or whether they're run without using the word run. It's all going to be with 50, the maximum square footage, and all contained.
Thank you.
Yep.
Director Lieber, is there a maximum number of chickens?
Well, yes, there is 10 hens, no roosters. And that is contained in the general offenses code.
Which would be the 50519?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Glassburn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will, in a jokingly fashion, point out that these runs, which are temporary structures, have 180 days to be removed, but our ramps, we're proposing 30 days. Thank you.
On that note, are there any other questions? Okay, I am going to make a recommendation to all of council that we pass ordinance 2020-77 with these changes as amended.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Mr. Schuman or Mr. Limpert, I didn't hear your aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Director Lieber, Mr. Schuman, thank you so much for your hard work on this. This was good stuff. Thank you. And our meeting concludes at 8:11. I apologize for the going over.